Just like with part one, I have with me Cognitia's AI experts, Jamison Ducey, Charles Dunn, and Christina Torres. Thank each of you for joining me again today. And last time, our kickoff episode, we covered the definition of GenAI and the difference of it between traditional AI and for how long it's been around. Quite surprising, right? We dove into popular models like Gemini, Anthropic's Claude, and OpenAI. And we even talked about the potential of model collapse, a newer term for myself, as well as I know for some of our listeners. Super interesting. And we're actually going to pick off kind of in that same realm on the data side. And we discussed last time about the sheer amount of data these large language models use, LLMs. And I think anytime we think about data being used, we have to think about security for a company or an individual. So Charles, starting us off, being in the data area yourself when you're doing a lot of your instruction and teaching, what security concerns do users and companies have in relation to having their data being utilized by GenAI?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So the issue of security with language models is multifaceted, but let's have a look at one of the most immediate concerns, and that is my data being used to train the next generation of models? And this is from the perspective of both end users and large companies. Large companies are using language models for things like customer-facing chatbots or internal data analytics. And in both of those cases, the model needs access to private company information. And so the company needs to be sure that their data is not being used by the AI company to train the next generation of models. Again, for two reasons. One, the models could regurgitate this information with the correct malicious prompt in the next generation of the model. And two, monetary reasons. Data is valuable. Companies know this, and so they don't want to give it away for free. AI companies live on ingesting massive amounts of data, and they would very much like to have all of this data for free because it's valuable. So this is a question of contracts. The company says our data cannot be used to train the next generation of models, and with this contract in writing, we're going to pay you to use your model. And security like this, usually it could go so far as to say, here's a dedicated physical set of server racks in the data center. Mm-hmm. Your data never leaves these server racks, never touches the public internet. From an end user perspective, it's a little bit different because end users don't collectively have as much power to influence the AI company that large corporations do. So there's a lot of risk in interacting with these free models, these free instances of these models where your data is just theirs now. Every interaction that you have, all of the data that you send it is pretty much fair game for the AI company to train their next generation of models on your data, on your interactions with their models. So if you're not paying for something, you're part of the training data to update a common saying. So it's something that you, as the end user, basically have to assume that risk in order to use any of these services.
Perfect. Thank you for covering that so thoroughly. I think a follow-up question, and it hits on, I guess, the individual server rack for, say, larger companies, or even if I'm paying for the subscription model for ChatGPT, I'm secure, right? And that data may not be used. I can turn that off. At least they tell me. How does that work, right? So say, let's picture on a grander scale, a pharmaceutical company. That data is incredibly sensitive. What OpenAI, ChatGPT's company, what they're saying is, hey, look, we're going to turn off the valve and that data is not going to leak through anything else. That's what you're saying when you're saying they're on their own server rack?
That could be the case. Private cloud, if you for the developers, it's just like instead of the public internet, it's your own. It is your private instance. Never touches the public internet. So, whatever mechanism by which that is facilitated, if we take OpenAI at their word, if we take Google at their word, if we take Microsoft at their word, that data is not being used by anything else. But again, we do have to kind of take their word for it.
That's all we could do. That's all we could do. So, and for my non-technical audience, basically they're putting your data in a safe and they're keeping it secure so nobody else can access it as long as you keep paying them. But also they are buying data, right? As we've seen from Reddit as an example to get more and more data. We'll see how that turns out. Thanks, Charles. Christina, another immensely important topic here is ethical AI. If you're not thinking about the security of your data, you're definitely thinking about the ethical side of it. And I wanted to have you answer this question because you were recently at an Ivy League campus, and this was probably the most popular discussion points addressed throughout. So when we hear ethical AI, what does that mean? And what can be done to implement it?
So when I think of ethical AI, I really think of two different things. The ethical sourcing of data for the AI's corpus or its knowledge bases, and also the ethical use of AI. So like how you're actually using it. So let's start with sourcing the data for the AI's corpus. You want to make sure that when you're curating data, you are minimizing the bias that's present in that training data. And one of the standout methods, there's a lot of different routes we can go about doing this, but the standout out of them all is going to be Anthropic's Claude model. And that is what's known as constitutional AI. That just means that we are using reinforcement learning with AI feedback in order to train the model to follow a set of rules and guidelines that is the Constitution, the AI's Constitution. These sets of rules will dictate right and wrong to the model, and it uses the AI model. It uses one AI to kind of train the other to learn, hey, this is right, this is wrong. And then that model will dictate to model B when you're generating, hey, that generated content is good or bad. It's ethical, unethical. So long and short of it, but the key here to making sure that it's actually minimizing bias is making sure that the Constitution is wide enough in range and comprehensive enough to like cover all of your edge cases where you would see these biases popping up. And it's going to be a continuous updating process as you see it. Now, when we, Now, when we think about copyright infringement, that's going to be mainly listening to what's known as the robot.txt file when you're web scraping. Now, robot.txt is a common plain text file that's included on, I want to say, most websites. And it's just dictating to web scrapers what sites, what URLs can I specifically access and gain information for web scraping, which is, taking the data that's on one website and then just putting it in your own data source, scraping the data from a website. A lot of websites don't allow web scraping, and that robot.txt file is unfortunately very easy to just either ignore or bypass. They can ignore the rules that's in the robot.txt file, or they can change the name of their web scraper, and then the text file will never even apply to them. So when we start doing that, that is us kind of gaining access to copyrighted data, and very easy to do. Now, just moving forward though, the other side of this is going to be the ethical use of AI, and that's going to just be using the AI ethically. So not creating deep fakes, not spreading misinformation, and like when work is generated by the AI and it's not the original work, it's like cited work, actually getting the citation and giving the original creator their due credit. And these are all things that can actually be mitigated early on in the training stages.
Wow. Thanks for walking us through that and all these different aspects. And I think If you saw the news article, I believe OpenAI just got in trouble for something along the lines of that web scraping. Follow-up question to you, Christina, and I think Claude, Anthropic's Claude, may be your favorite LLM out there. Using constitutional AI, how come the other companies, the popular ones that we hear, are not going down that same exact route?
So keep in mind, when we do constitutional AI, it is very tightly knit together with reinforcement learning, with AI feedback. So in order to implement it, we do have to implement that form of training, and not all models follow that training cycle or that training rules. One of the big reasons I would say it's not widely adopted is going to be it takes a lot of overhead to train two AI models that are evaluating each other. So that's going to be a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of knowledge that you have to invest into the system to revamp it, to change it to constitutional. So not ideal for every company.
It always plays a factor. And both our points discussed today so far, money was brought up. Right. And how could it not be, even though a lot of times it's advertised as a free product in certain situations. So thank you for sharing that. We'll keep an eye open on how that continues. Also, Anthropic releasing a new model just recently that's scoring higher than some of the ChatGPT 4.0 benchmark scores. Cool. Thank you, Christina. Finally, Jamison, during the series, we want to share a few use cases. Can you share with us maybe one or two real world case studies that may have occurred, issues or newsworthy, that fit into challenges with security and ethics?
Can't hurt, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Let's see. So first one, I think a lot of people might recognize because it's been sort of in pop culture reference for the past year and a half or so. Earlier on, before fact-checking these large language models really became a big thing and most people were aware of it, there was a lawyer who was working on an argument for a case and asked ChatGPT for certain references to other relevant court cases. And ChatGPT just kind of made up a few references, and the lawyer used that in his argument. And he didn't fact-check, he didn't double-check if those were real. And somebody else did, of course, in the case, and it was brought to their attention, and certain repercussions were given, but nobody really knew exactly who to blame on that, and so we have further building out of certain rules and policies for that at this point. But at that point, it wasn't as big of a thing, which now it is. Did you hear about that case at all, Rich?
Yeah, I certainly did, and it's just mind blowing, and it just shows how people will cut corners or use this tool to cut corners, even when it's not ethical, right? And that's where the hallucinations piece is. It's almost a blessing and a curse in this situation, where obviously it's a curse for us that want to use it the right way. But it was a blessing. Here we caught somebody trying to kind of bend the law as a lawyer, right? It was super interesting. So what else do you have? Is there another one as well?
Yeah, in terms of more on the data privacy side, I suppose this could be also ethical. When you're building out a model, you have to use a huge data set, right? As Charles said in the previous episode in part 1, these transformer models are huge. They take a lot of data, and it takes a while for them to really glean some of the deeper patterns from that. Now, those patterns can be biased if the data set is itself biased. But on the other hand, that data itself can also not necessarily be as ethically sourced, right? Like what Christina was talking about. And this is kind of a big thing, especially when it comes to transparency. OpenAI tends to be a pretty big proponent of making sure that everybody can use their model, but they don't tend to be very transparent in terms of the training process or in terms of the data that they use. So we can't really none of the users or none of the people who are seeing this can really throw any kinds of accusations at them because they don't actually know what data is being used. However, with Google and with some other open source projects, the data set itself is pretty explicitly explained. In a lot of cases, they use a public data set. Another pretty big example that's pretty near and dear to my own heart is Midjourney. I use Midjourney a lot. It's an image generation program. And they use a huge data set that takes art from all over the internet, like ArtStation, a bunch of other places as well. And this has been a pretty big hot topic recently, of course, because these artists feel like their work is being stolen. And so a lot of newer policies are being put into place in terms of how exactly can we mitigate that? How can we make everybody happy, the artists and the users of this particular platform? And that is usually up to the developers of the platform themselves, right? That's not really a user end use case, right?
You know what it brings to light too, Jamison? I'm glad you mentioned Midjourney, is it just shows we still are in a new frontier with this. And the technology is going faster with the rules and regulations that we have in place. Jamison, a quick follow-up question as we wrap on up here. Will the rules and regulations ever catch up to the technology at this point?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, with the speed that technology is advancing at this point, especially with this wave, I don't think that's going to be a constant thing. I'm sure that it'll slow down eventually once we start really ironing things out. But from what I've seen, it takes a while for the legal side to really catch up. Now, this year, we're going to probably see some updates and policy changes when it comes to copyright. The U.S. Copyright Office is going to be issuing some new rules. We'll see how drastically that changes things and how that affects the larger companies and the smaller companies. But it really is kind of a back and forth, I would say. And it does take the legal side a little bit longer to respond because they tend to be a little bit more detail-oriented in the language.
I'd say so, bogged down by process as well. So, and maybe we'll talk more about it as in our next part 3 of this series, where we'll discuss the future of GenAI and not just what the capabilities but how it will impact us as workers or individuals. So, Jamison, Charles, Christina, excellent, as always. And for the jump and for our part 2 of our GenAI series, I'm Rich Bowers. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye.